Sherri Rasmussen was the kind of person who left an impression on everyone she met. Her brilliance shone in her career as a nurse, where she excelled not just as a practitioner, but as a leader. As the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, she was widely respected for her compassion and dedication. She spent her days mentoring colleagues, advocating for patient care, and constantly improving the lives of those around her. At just 29 years old, she had achieved what many in her field could only dream of. Her personal life was equally fulfilling. Sherri had recently married John Rutan, a charismatic and successful man she had fallen deeply in love with. Their love story was one of those rare connections that seemed almost storybook perfect. The couple was building a life together in their cozy Los Angeles condo, where they shared plans for the future and dreams of growing old together. But everything changed on the morning of February 24th, 1986. Sherri had decided to stay home, recovering from a recent cold, while John left for work as usual. Hours later, John would return to find the unthinkable. His wife was dead. She had been violently beaten, and a gunshot wound to her chest ended her life. The scene investigators found painted a disturbing picture. Drawers were pulled out and overturned, and shards of broken glass were scattered across the floor. Sherri's body lay in the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of what seemed to be a home invasion gone wrong. Detectives quickly concluded that Sherri must have interrupted burglars, and the situation had turned deadly. But was it really that simple? As investigators walked through the Rasmussens' shattered condo, they cataloged the evidence before them. Broken glass from a patio door suggested forced entry. Furniture was overturned, and drawers had been rifled through as if someone had been looking for valuables. Yet, something about the scene felt off. Sherri's body bore the marks of a desperate fight. She had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms told the story of a woman who had fought for her life. A gunshot wound to her chest confirmed the brutal end of the struggle. Her husband, John, was inconsolable. Detectives interviewed him on site, noting his deep shock and sorrow. John described Sherri as the light of his life and couldn't fathom why anyone would harm her. When asked if there were enemies or threats in their lives, he could think of no one. Initially, the pieces seemed to fit a narrative of random violence, a burglary that spiraled out of control. Sherri, home alone, had caught the intruders in the act and had paid the ultimate price. Yet, as detectives combed through the evidence, small inconsistencies began to raise questions. Why were expensive items such as electronics and jewelry left untouched? Why was the alarm system not triggered despite the apparent break-in? And why did the signs of the burglary seem more like staged chaos than a genuine crime of opportunity? The condo felt eerily silent, but it spoke volumes to those willing to listen. There was a story buried in the overturned furniture and shattered glass, one that hinted at a far more personal motive. Was this truly the work of random intruders, or was Sherri's death the result of something much darker and closer to home? Detectives would soon realize that the crime scene held secrets waiting to be uncovered if only they were willing to look beyond the surface. The initial investigation into Sherri Rasmussen's death moved with unsettling haste. Authorities determined that Sherri must have surprised burglars in the act, leading to a confrontation that turned deadly. The disarray in the condo, coupled with the signs of a struggle, seemed to corroborate this theory. Detectives cited the broken glass from the sliding patio door as the burglar's point of entry. With no immediate evidence to suggest a more complex motive, the case was swiftly categorized as a burglary gone wrong. It was a narrative that allowed the police to close the investigation and move on, sparing resources and time. But there were troubling details that investigators seemed to overlook or perhaps ignore. For one, the burglary theory didn't align with the items left behind. High-value electronics and Sherri's jewelry remained untouched, suggesting theft wasn't the primary motive. Additionally, the violence Sherri endured during the attack seemed far too personal for a random encounter. Critical evidence like the bite mark on Sherri's arm was not processed or prioritized. The case's urgency or lack thereof led to key details being dismissed as insignificant. These oversights would haunt the investigation for years to come as Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, began to question whether justice had truly been sought. In an effort to support their burglary theory, police focused on two local men with a history of breaking and entering. Both were known to operate in the neighborhood and fit the profile of opportunistic criminals. On paper, they seemed like plausible suspects. But as investigators examined the crime scene, inconsistencies in this theory became glaringly apparent. First, the prolonged struggle between Sherri and her assailant was unusual for a simple burglary. Most thieves aimed to get in and out quickly, avoiding confrontation at all costs. Why would these supposed burglars risk such an extensive fight with Sherri, leaving behind evidence that could easily lead to their capture? Second, the condo's alarm system had not been triggered. If this were a standard break-in, how had the intruders bypassed it without alerting anyone? The absence of forced entry into the unit itself also raised eyebrows. The broken glass from the patio door appeared staged rather than the result of a genuine break-in. These discrepancies didn't escape the attention of Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen. He voiced his doubts to the police, insisting that Sherri's death wasn't the result of random violence. He suspected someone with a personal grudge, someone who knew Sherri or had a motive to harm her. His pleas, however, were dismissed as grief-fueled speculation. The police remained committed to their initial theory, and the investigation soon stalled. The questionable suspects were eventually ruled out, but no new leads were pursued. The case, now considered cold, quietly faded into the background. Yet the unanswered questions lingered. Who had the time, the motive, and the unrelenting rage to carry out such a brutal attack? And why did the investigation seem so reluctant to uncover the truth? It would take decades for these questions to resurface and for the shocking answers to finally emerge. In the wake of Sherri Rasmussen's death, attention naturally turned to her husband, John Ruetten. In many murder investigations, the spouse is often the first suspect. Statistically, those closest to the victim are more likely to be involved, and investigators couldn't ignore the possibility. John, however, appeared genuinely devastated. Friends and family described him as heartbroken, consumed by guilt for not being home that day to protect Sherri. But grief didn't spare him from questions. Detectives probed into the couple's relationship, asking if there were arguments, financial troubles, or any indication of infidelity. John painted a picture of a happy marriage. He spoke of Sherri with adoration, describing her as his soulmate. There were no signs of strife, no whispered accusations of secret affairs. Yet, as the investigation stalled, whispers began to swirl. Could his grief be an act? Did he have something to hide? The seeds of doubt, once planted, were hard to uproot. While there was no evidence implicating John, the lingering cloud of suspicion subtly shifted focus away from other potential leads. It would be years before this misplaced scrutiny would be understood as a diversion, one that allowed the real perpetrator to slip through the cracks. The crime scene told a story of struggle and desperation. Sherri Rasmussen, a woman of strength and determination, had not gone down without a fight. Bruises on her body and defensive wounds on her arms suggested she had fought her attacker with everything she had. But one clue stood out: a bite mark on her forearm. Bite marks are often among the most personal forms of evidence, suggesting rage and physical proximity between the victim and the assailant. In this case, it was undeniable proof that Sherri had fought back. If analyzed, the bite mark could have provided a wealth of forensic evidence, including DNA. Yet inexplicably, the bite mark was overlooked. Detectives noted it in their reports, but no effort was made to test it. The DNA it held remained untouched, sealed away in evidence bags that gathered dust. Was this negligence, a lack of resources, or something more sinister? This oversight would become one of the case's most glaring failures. The very clue that could have cracked the case wide open was ignored, allowing the perpetrator to remain free. For Sherri's family, this was a devastating blow, one of many in their long fight for justice. By the late 1980s, Sherri Rasmussen's murder had been relegated to the cold case files, a grim repository for unsolved crimes. For Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, this was unacceptable. They refused to let their daughter's case be forgotten, launching their own campaign to keep her memory alive. Nels, in particular, was relentless. He wrote letters to the LAPD, pleading with them to reopen the investigation. He voiced his suspicions that the burglary theory was a cover for something far more sinister. But time and again, his concerns were dismissed. The police assured him they had done all they could. As years turned into decades, the Rasmussen family's grief became a quiet undercurrent in their lives. Holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries passed without Sherri. Her murder became a haunting absence, a wound that refused to heal. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic technology were changing the landscape of criminal investigations. DNA testing, once in its infancy, had become a powerful tool for solving cold cases. But Sherri's case remained untouched, her file buried beneath countless others. It would take more than 2 decades and the persistence of one determined detective to finally bring her story back into the light. And when it did, the truth it revealed would shock even the most seasoned investigators. For over 2 decades, Nels Rasmussen lived with the unrelenting pain of his daughter's unsolved murder. While others moved on, he could not. To Nels, the idea of closure without justice was unthinkable. He believed with every fiber of his being that the story of a botched burglary was wrong, that Sherri's death had been far more deliberate. Nels was relentless. He wrote dozens of letters to the LAPD, each one a plea to take another look at Sherri's case. He pointed out the inconsistencies, the untouched valuables, the personal nature of the attack, and the bite mark that had been ignored. His frustration was palpable, as was his grief, but his cries for justice fell on deaf ears. He refused to let Sherri's case fade into obscurity. Nels met with detectives, attended community meetings, and even reached out to the media, hoping to stir public interest. His tireless advocacy kept the case alive, even when the LAPD seemed content to leave it cold. Though it seemed like no one was listening, Nels's determination would eventually pay off. His persistence became a spark, a catalyst that ensured Sherri's case would not be forgotten. When advancements in forensic science presented new opportunities, it was Nels's unyielding push for answers that ensured the evidence would finally be re-examined. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had revolutionized criminal investigations. Cases once thought unsolvable were now being reopened and cracked wide open thanks to advancements in forensic analysis. Sherri's murder, long considered a dead end, was about to get its long overdue moment of reckoning. Detectives assigned to the lab's cold case unit revisited Sherri's file, spurred in part by Nels Rasmussen's persistence. Among the evidence was the overlooked bite mark, which had never undergone DNA testing. The mark, preserved on Sherri's arm, had the potential to identify her killer, something unimaginable in 1986. When the DNA was finally analyzed, the results were both shocking and unexpected. The profile did not match any of the original burglary suspects, ruling out the narrative that had been accepted for decades. Instead, it pointed to someone entirely unexpected, a woman. This revelation upended the case and forced detectives to ask a chilling question: who would have a personal motive to harm Sherri? The answer came from an unlikely source, the LAPD itself. The DNA led investigators to Stephanie Lazarus, a respected police officer with a seemingly spotless career. Her name wasn't new to the case. In fact, it had been mentioned briefly during the original investigation, but dismissed without much thought. Now, decades later, her name returned, and the pieces began to fall into place. Stephanie Lazarus was no ordinary suspect. A seasoned LAPD detective, she had spent years upholding the very laws she was now accused of breaking. Her reputation within the department was solid, and she was well liked by her peers. To many, the idea of her being involved in a murder seemed inconceivable. But Stephanie had a history with Sherri Rasmussen and with Sherri's husband, John Rutten. Years before, Stephanie and John had dated. Their relationship had ended long before John met Sherri, but for Stephanie, it was a wound that had never fully healed. She had remained close to John even after his marriage to Sherri, but their interactions carried an undercurrent of unresolved feelings. During the original investigation, Stephanie's name had come up in passing. Sherri's parents had even mentioned their suspicion of a jealous ex-girlfriend during interviews with police. But these concerns were brushed aside, and Stephanie was never seriously considered as a suspect. Now, with the DNA evidence pointing directly to her, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a grim picture. The brutal nature of Sherri's murder, marked by rage and personal contact, aligned with a crime of passion. Stephanie's connection to John provided a clear motive, and her position within the LAPD explained how she had managed to avoid scrutiny for so long. The case had taken a dark turn, revealing a betrayal not just of Sherri Rasmussen, but of the justice system itself. As investigators prepared to confront Stephanie, they knew they were about to expose a scandal that would shake the LAPD to its core. The revelation that Stephanie Lazarus was connected to John Rutten added a deeply unsettling layer to the case. Stephanie wasn't just any suspect, she was John's former girlfriend, someone who had once shared a romantic connection with the man Sherri married. Stephanie and John's relationship had ended years before he met Sherri, but it wasn't the clean break that John had perhaps thought it was. Stephanie had reportedly struggled to let go, maintaining contact with John even after he moved on. Friends later recalled her as someone who wasn't shy about expressing her lingering feelings for him. When John chose to marry Sherri, it may have been a turning point for Stephanie. Investigators speculated that her heartbreak, coupled with jealousy, had festered into something far darker. Could a woman who had sworn to protect and serve allow those emotions to consume her so completely that she committed murder? The idea was chilling. If Stephanie was capable of such a crime, it meant she had lived a double life for decades, one as a trusted law enforcement officer and another as a cold-blooded killer. As investigators delved deeper into Stephanie Lazarus's past, they uncovered a tangled web of emotions that pointed directly to a motive. While John Rutten described his relationship with Stephanie as casual and long over, it was clear that Stephanie had seen it differently. She had been close to John, and when he chose Sherri, it struck a nerve. Witnesses later recounted how Stephanie had expressed resentment toward Sherri. In one incident, Stephanie reportedly visited John at work and tearfully confessed her feelings, asking if they still had a chance. John rebuffed her, reaffirming his commitment to Sherri, but Stephanie's reaction hinted at an emotional instability that went unaddressed. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Sherri's parents had long suspected that jealousy might have been the driving force behind the murder, and now it seemed they had been right all along. For Stephanie, the murder was not a random act of violence, but a deliberate act of rage and betrayal, a way to eliminate the woman she saw as standing in her way. The crime scene itself supported this theory. The bite mark on Sherri's arm, the prolonged struggle, and the brutality of the attack all pointed to an assailant who had a personal connection to the victim. This was not the work of a random burglar, it was an act of passion. Stephanie Lazarus had lived a seemingly untouchable life for decades, rising through the ranks of the LAPD while Sherri's murder case languished unsolved. The question loomed large. How had an officer with such a personal connection to the victim avoided detection for so long? The answer was as troubling as it was damning. Investigators began to suspect that Stephanie's position within the LAPD had afforded her protection. Whether through deliberate cover-ups or unintentional biases, the original investigation had failed to scrutinize Stephanie despite clear red flags. There were whispers of corruption, of colleagues who might have looked the other way or dismissed evidence to protect one of their own. The lab's reputation was already tarnished by scandals in the 1980s, and the idea that an officer might have exploited the system to evade justice only deepened the public's mistrust. Even more disturbing was the possibility that the DNA evidence could have remained untested indefinitely if not for the persistence of Nels Rasmussen and advancements in forensic science. Sherri's case exposed cracks in the system cracks that allowed a killer to walk free for over 20 years. As the investigation into Stephanie Lazarus intensified, it became clear that the case was about more than just one woman's actions. It was about accountability, integrity, and the devastating consequences of a justice system failing to uphold its principles. When detectives finally confronted Stephanie Lazarus about Sherri Rasmussen's murder, they expected a seasoned officer to remain calm and collected. But Stephanie's behavior during questioning told a different story. Her initial reactions were defensive and dismissive. She denied any involvement, brushing off her prior relationship with John Rutan as insignificant. Yet, as the conversation progressed, her tone shifted. She became evasive, offering vague answers and visibly bristling under scrutiny. Detectives pushed harder, presenting her with the evidence, the DNA from the bite mark. This was no circumstantial lead, it was irrefutable proof linking her to the crime. Stephanie's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The confidence she had exuded as a respected law enforcement officer was replaced by visible unease. The cracks in her alibi widened with every passing moment. Her inability to provide a coherent explanation for the DNA evidence only deepened suspicions. It became clear that Stephanie had spent decades hiding behind the badge, hoping that her connection to the LAPD would shield her from accountability. The once impenetrable wall of lies she had built around herself was falling apart. The DNA evidence was undeniable, and Stephanie Lazarus's darkest secret was finally exposed. The arrest of Stephanie Lazarus sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and beyond. It wasn't just that a murder suspect had been apprehended, it was who she was. Stephanie Lazarus, a decorated LAPD detective, was accused of a brutal, cold-blooded killing. The moment itself was dramatic. After carefully gathering evidence and building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of both the court and public opinion, detectives moved in. Stephanie was taken into custody at the very police station where she had worked for years. The weight of the revelation hit her colleagues hard. How could one of their own, a trusted officer, be capable of such a heinous crime? For the community, Stephanie's arrest cracked the veneer of trust in law enforcement. People began questioning how someone sworn to uphold justice could betray it so profoundly. It wasn't just about Sherri Rasmussen's murder. It was about the integrity of the LAPD and the systemic failures that had allowed the case to remain unsolved for decades. The arrest marked a turning point, not only in the investigation but also in public perception. Justice was finally within reach, but the path to accountability was far from over. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus was a legal and emotional battlefield. For prosecutors, it was a chance to expose the truth that jealousy and rage had driven Stephanie to murder Sherri Rasmussen in a fit of passion. For the defense, it was a desperate scramble to explain away the damning DNA evidence and paint Stephanie as a victim of circumstance. Prosecutors presented a compelling case, highlighting Stephanie's obsession with John Rutten and the clear motive rooted in unrequited love. They described the murder as an act of personal vengeance, fueled by Stephanie's inability to let go of her past. The bite mark DNA, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, was irrefutable proof that Stephanie had been at the crime scene. The defense tried to undermine the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination or mishandling of samples. They argued that Stephanie had no reason to kill Sherri and that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. But the sheer weight of the prosecution's narrative, combined with Stephanie's evasive behavior during questioning, painted a damning picture. For Sherri's family, the trial was both agonizing and cathartic. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the case they had fought to reopen finally received the attention it deserved. The trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was a reckoning. It forced the LAPD and the public to confront the flaws in a system that had allowed a killer to go undetected for decades. As the proceedings drew to a close, one question remained. Would justice prevail after so many years of failure? After decades of pain and unanswered questions, the moment of reckoning finally arrived. The jury, presented with overwhelming evidence, delivered a verdict. Stephanie Lazarus was guilty of the first-degree murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The irrefutable bite mark DNA, combined with the narrative of jealousy and rage, left no room for reasonable doubt. Stephanie, once a trusted member of the LAPD, was sentenced to serve 27 years to life in prison. For Sherri's family, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Sherri back. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had fought tirelessly for this outcome, and while it offered some closure, it was a stark reminder of the years his family had spent in limbo. The conviction was more than a victory for Sherri's loved ones. It was a testament to the power of persistence and the advancements in forensic science that finally unearthed the truth. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus sent shockwaves through the LAPD. The case exposed significant flaws in the department's handling of both Sherri's murder and its own personnel. How had an officer under their watch committed such a crime and gone undetected for decades? The LAPD faced harsh criticism for its initial investigation. Many questioned whether bias or intentional neglect had played a role in overlooking Stephanie as a suspect. The failure to test the bite mark DNA earlier was a glaring oversight, emblematic of a system that had, at best, been careless or, at worst, complicit. In the aftermath, the department initiated internal reviews and implemented policy changes to prevent similar failures. Cold case protocols were revisited, and the LAPD sought to restore public trust by promising greater transparency and accountability. But the damage to its reputation was undeniable. The case of Sherri Rasmussen became a haunting reminder of what happens when the justice system fails the very people it is sworn to protect. Even with Stephanie Lazarus behind bars, lingering questions cast a shadow over the case. Did others in the LAPD suspect Stephanie and remain silent to protect one of their own? Were the failures in the investigation purely incompetence, or were they deliberate attempts to shield her? Sherri's parents and legal experts raised concerns about the culture within the LAPD at the time. The department's history of scandals and corruption added weight to these suspicions. Had the thin blue line contributed to years of inaction, or was Stephanie's role as an officer purely coincidental? The bite mark DNA was pivotal in solving the case, but why was it ignored for so long? Had it been tested earlier, Sherri's family might have found justice decades sooner. These unresolved questions leave a sense of unease, suggesting that the system may still harbor cracks capable of swallowing other cases whole. Sherri Rasmussen's story is one of profound loss, but also unyielding determination. Her life, tragically cut short became the center of a relentless fight for justice, a fight led by her family, particularly her father, Nels Rasmussen. Nels's refusal to accept the initial narrative, his tireless advocacy, and the eventual breakthroughs in DNA technology proved that even the most daunting obstacles could be overcome. Sherri's case is a stark reminder of the importance of persistence and the need for systemic reform. But it also poses a sobering challenge. How many other victims have been failed by similar oversights? How many families are still waiting for answers? Sherri's story forces us to reflect on the countless cold cases left unresolved and the systemic changes needed to ensure justice for all. Though the Rasmussen family now has closure, Sherri's legacy endures as a symbol of resilience and the pursuit of truth. It is a reminder that even in the face of corruption and indifference, justice, while delayed, can prevail.